Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when we talk about foundational texts in modern thought, there are a few that stand as just absolute monoliths.
Huge pillars, yeah.
And today we are taking on one of the biggest, Adam Smith's 1776 masterpiece, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations.
Phew. Yeah, it's often quoted, sometimes may misquoted, but rarely read cover to cover. It's massive.
It really is. 5 whole books.
And that's key. Today, we're focusing laser-like only in the first of those 5. Book on. This is the blueprint.
That's exactly right. Book I isn't really about the tariffs or trade policy or, state finance stuff that all comes later in the other books.
Right.
Book I is almost pure economic philosophy and maybe human psychology, too. It's like the engine room.
Good analogy. It explains how wealth gets created in the first place, how we measure it, how it gets initially, distributed among people.
So our mission today is to really get under the hood of that revolutionary mechanism Smith laid out. We're trying to uncover his answer to this question that, well, it troubled philosophers for centuries, right?
For sure. Which is, how does this incredibly complex, functioning social order just emerge? Especially when every single individual is basically just pursuing their own self-interest.
Yeah, because the natural assumption, and you see this with lots of prior thinkers, was, okay, without heavy moral rules or legal constraints, selfish people, well, they'd just descend into chaos.
Or conflict, or just everyone trying to grab what they can in a zero-sum game.
But Smith comes along and argues that's fundamentally wrong.
Completely flips it.
Yeah.
He demonstrates that order isn't imposed from above, by a king or a government planning committee.
No.
It's generated spontaneously from the very nature of exchange between these self-interested individuals.
Some monumental reversal of philosophical thinking, really.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much where modern economic science as we know it truly kicks off.
Okay, so let's unpack that core premise then. Smith doesn't start with government rules or regulations. He starts with us, human nature.
Right.
What's his fundamental take on us as, economic actors?
Well, he sees us as complex. We are, and he's very clear about this, undeniably driven by self-interest and egoism, maybe, that pushes us to seek advantage for ourselves, our families.
Okay.
But crucially, he also thinks we're rational. We can calculate that advantage. And maybe most importantly for Book Ein, we possess this fundamental inherent tendency to, what does he call it, barter, truck, and exchange one thing for another.
Right, that famous phrase. So it's not just pure greed running rampant, it's channeled self-interest.
That's a good way to put it. You want the best for yourself, sure. But you quickly realize the only reliable way to get what you want is by providing something someone else wants in return.
It's a transactional kind of egoism.
Precisely. Yeah. And his observation is that this pursuit of individual benefit, it doesn't have to be antagonistic. In fact, it requires coordination. If I want your expertise, say, you're a better baker than I am. I have to offer you something you value more than the cost of your time baking bread for me.
So it naturally leads us away from just fighting over resources and towards specialization, towards social coordination.
That's the argument. It pushes us in that direction.
But isn't relying purely on self-interest? I mean, isn't that inherently dangerous? Does Smith provide any kind of philosophical guardrails early on? Or is it just pure laissez-faire right from the beginning? Because I think a lot of listeners might worry, okay, relying on self-interest just empowers the strong to exploit the weak.
Yeah, and that's a critical challenge. It's why Smith's starting point is so revolutionary, but also why it's often misunderstood, I think. He isn't endorsing moral license, saying anything goes.
Okay.
He's simply stating that the economic engine, the thing that creates wealth, functions on this self-interested motor. The coordination happens because of mutual benefit.
Mutual.
If the transaction isn't beneficial to both parties, or at least if they don't perceive it as beneficial, it just won't happen, or at least not sustainably.
So the guardrails, the rules, the ethics, that's stuff society layers on top of this basic engine.
Exactly. That's a point we can definitely come back to later. But fundamentally, his thesis in Book I is that self-interest is this natural, powerful force that perhaps counterintuitively drives coordination, not just conflict.
Okay, so the premise holds. Individual self-interest somehow leads directly to this vast, complex social order. But how does that order actually generate wealth? You need more than just order. You need an engine that multiplies output, something beyond what a simple community could achieve just trading favors.
Right, and that engine.
Yeah.
Well, that's the subject of Smith's most famous observations in all of Book I, maybe in the whole Wealth of Nations, the division of labor, or Doel, as economists often say. This is the absolute central mechanism by which society organizes production and, crucially, generates surplus.
Surplus being the key word there.
Absolutely. But the subtlety here, which I think is often missed, is that Smith insists the division of labor isn't some top-down planned economic policy.
Yeah.
It's not like a committee decided this would be more efficient.
Right, it's not an invention.
No, he argues it's a consequence. It results naturally, almost inevitably, from that human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange we just talked about.
So it emerges spontaneously from the market itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, when I realize I can get shoes more easily by just making nails all day, something I'm maybe good at, and then trading my extra nails for shoes.
Rather than trying to cobble together some rough shoes yourself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That realization, repeated millions of times by millions of people making similar calculations for their own benefit, that's what segments labor across the entire economy.
And to demonstrate the sheer power of this segmentation, Smith gives us that absolutely iconic, essential anecdote that kicks off book one, the pin factory.
Ah, yes, the pin factory.
We have to bring that story to life for you, the listener, because it's really the core proof of concept for the whole argument.
It really is. And this anecdote shows why specialization isn't just additive like 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah.
It shows it's exponentially productive.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So Smith asks us to imagine, say, 10 workers, and they're trying to make pins individually. Each worker would have to do I think he says 18 separate operations required to make a single pin.
18 steps for one pin. Like what?
Things like drawing out the wire, straightening it, cutting it to length, pointing one end, grinding the other end to put the head on, actually attaching the head, maybe whitening the pins, and so on. A lot of distinct tasks.
Okay, so if each of the 10 workers did all 18 tasks themselves, how many pins could they make in a day, according to Smith's observation?
Well, he estimated that even a really diligent, dedicated worker performing all those tasks might barely manage to complete one pin a day.
One pin?
Maybe 10 if they were incredibly motivated and already skillful. So for 10 workers, you're looking at maybe 10 pins total on a bad day. Maybe 200 pins total if they're all really good and working flat out.
Okay, 10 to 200 pins from 10 workers. But then, what happens when they divide the labor? When each worker specializes in just one or two of those simple, narrow, repetitive tasks?
The output just explodes. Smith's research or observation found that those same 10 workers, properly specialized in coordinating their efforts, they could collectively produce upwards of 48,000 pins in a single day.
48,000 compared to maybe 10 or 200?
Exactly. 48,000.
Yeah.
It's this staggering, almost unbelievable exponential result purely from specialization.
Wow.
It demonstrates that creating wealth isn't just about individuals working harder. It's fundamentally an organizational thing. It's systemic.
That multiplier is just mind-boggling. 48,000 pins instead of maybe 20. Okay, so what's driving that? Smith breaks it down, right? He identifies 3 distinct reasons for this explosive increase in productivity from the division of labor. This is the crucial detail, the nuts and bolts.
Yes, he does. The first reason is the increase in dexterity and skill in each particular worker.
Makes sense. Practice makes perfect.
Right. When a worker focuses solely on one task, say, just pointing the wire, day in, day out, they become incredibly fast and efficient at that specific task. Their hands become trained through sheer repetition, minimizing wasted effort, wasted time.
So less fumbling, fewer errors, pure efficiency gained through just doing the same small thing over and over.
That's the first one. The second mechanism is the saving of time that is commonly lost in passing from one kind of work to another.
Ah, the switching costs.
Exactly. If I'm switching between, say, drawing the wire and then attaching the head, I lose time moving materials around, maybe adjusting my tools, even just mentally refocusing on the new task.
Yeah, you have to get back in the zone.
Smith points out these little switching costs, they add up dramatically over a whole workday. Specialization basically eliminates most of that idle transition time.
Okay, that's fascinating. So it's not just that I get better at the task, but the system itself removes the friction of starting and stopping different tasks.
And then there's the third reason, and this one is maybe the most powerful engine for long-term economic growth, the facilitation of the invention of new machinery and tools.
How does that work?
Smith notes that when a worker focuses really intensely on a single, often monotonous, repetitive task, they are much more likely than anyone else to observe ways to simplify or automate that process.
Because they're the ultimate expert on that one tiny step. They live and breathe it. So they're the first person to realize, hang on, a simple lever could do this faster, or a machine could automate this bit.
Exactly that. Or, as Smith famously recounts, maybe it's a small boy, just watching the process, who figures out a simple mechanical adjustment to save time or effort, perhaps initially, just so he can go play sooner.
Huh. Necessity, or maybe laziness, is the mother of invention.
Right. So innovation doesn't just come from, high-minded scientists and labs. It often comes directly from workers on the shop floor trying to make their own lives or their specific task easier. The division of labor itself thus becomes a driver, a mother of invention.
Okay, so the system is self-improving. Specialization makes me faster, dexterity. It saves the time I used to waste switching tasks, and it makes me more likely to invent a tool or machine that makes the process even more specialized and efficient.
It's a true virtuous cycle. Each element feeds the others.
Incredible, but surely there's a limit. You can't just specialize infinitely, can you?
No, and Smith immediately identifies the critical constraint on just how far you can push this specialization. And it's simple. The extent of the market.
Ah, right. You can only specialize deeply if you have a big enough market to actually buy all the stuff you're producing in your specialized role.
Exactly. If your market is tiny, you simply have to be a jack of all trades to survive.
Give us an example.
Well, imagine you are the absolute world's best professional pinpointer. You are incredibly fast, incredibly skilled, but you live in a tiny, isolated village of maybe 50 people.
Okay.
You're going to starve. Why? Because that tiny market of 50 people can probably only absorb, maybe a dozen pins a year, 100 at most.
Right. They just don't need that many pins.
So you'd spend 99% of your time being uselessly overspecialized. You'd have no choice but to also be a farmer, maybe mend some tools like a blacksmith, perhaps even cut hair like a barber, just to make ends meet. You're forced back into being a generalist.
So this directly implies that larger markets, denser populations, and especially urban center cities become absolutely essential for generating profound wealth.
Yes, because they allow for the deepest possible specialization. The pool of demand in a large city is wide enough and deep enough to absorb the massive, exponential surplus created by really intense division of labor.
And this creates that self-organizing social structure we touched on earlier.
Precisely. Increased specialization, Danny Dow, generates vast surplus. That surplus then drives demand for more exchange. People have more stuff to trade. More robust exchange, in turn, effectively broadens the market, which then allows for and even encourages even deeper specialization.
The whole system feeds itself, spiraling upwards into growing complexity and wealth.
That's the engine Smith describes in Book 1.
Okay, so we've got the engine running. The division of labor is churning out thousands upon thousands of specialized goods, pins, nails, shoes, bread, whatever.
Right, mountains of stuff.
But the very success of that specialization creates this massive logistical headache. How on earth do we actually trade all these tiny specialized surpluses efficiently?
Yeah, the system immediately grinds to a halt if you have to rely on simple barter. Now you, our listener, probably understand the basic problem of barter, the double coincidence of wants.
Meaning, I have to have what you want and you have to have what I want at the exact same time and place, which is tricky.
It's tricky even in a simple economy. But Smith's point is that this problem becomes exponentially worse as specialization deepens.
Right. The guy who spent all day making 4,800 pinheads doesn't want half a cow in return. He needs something he can use later to buy bread tomorrow, maybe shoes next week.
Exactly. You need a universal medium of exchange, something everyone agrees to accept. And Smith dedicates quite a bit of time here to tracing the historical rise of money as the essential solution to this barter problem.
He talks about its evolution, doesn't he?
Yes, from early common items, things like salt, maybe cattle, dried fish in some places, basically, items that had immediate common use value themselves.
Things everyone generally needed anyway.
Right. But then, over time, societies tended to gravitate towards using metals. First, maybe iron or copper, but eventually gold and silver became preferred.
And why metals? Was it just because they looked nice or were intrinsically more valuable than, say, food?
Not necessarily intrinsic value in that sense. Smith argues they were chosen primarily for their superior functional qualities as a medium of exchange.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, they are durable. They won't spoil like grain or fish. A gold coin can last centuries.
Good point.
Second, they are divisible. You can cut a small piece off a bar of silver to make change without destroying the value of the metal itself. Try making change with a live cow.
Yeah, not practical.
And third, they are relatively scarce and reasonably portable for their value. This combination ensures they tend to hold their value over time better than more common or perishable goods. So they naturally become the accepted common standard for exchange.
Okay, so metals win out for practical reasons. But this leads us to what feels like a really critical aha moment in Smith's theory of money. He suggests the physical material itself, the gold, the silver, is almost secondary in the end.
Yes, this is crucial. The money functions ultimately not because it's shiny metal, but because of a shared social commitment, a belief.
What kind of belief?
It functions because of a social promise. Money, in Smith's view, is essentially institutionalized trust.
Trust.
It's the collective belief that, regardless of whether this token is a gold coin, a silver piece, or even eventually a piece of paper, everyone who accepts this token from me today will recognize that it holds the same universally accepted value when they go to use it tomorrow.
So if that social promise, that trust, gets broken, say the king starts mixing lead into the gold coins to secretly debase the currency.
Or if there's severe institutional instability, maybe a civil war, where people lose faith in the future value.
Then the trust evaporates.
Completely. And when the trust evaporates, the entire structure of exchange breaks down. People refuse the money, they revert to barter if they can, or trade just stops. And that cripples the division of labor, because suddenly the pin maker can't easily trade his pins.
Wow. So the whole economic system we just described is fundamentally built on this fragile social contract about value.
Absolutely. It rests on that shared trust. And that realization leads us directly to the next crucial philosophical question Smith tackles. If money is just the nominal medium, the token of trust, what is the real measure of value underneath it all?
Right. How do we measure the actual worth of things? Smith tackles this with his famous distinction between nominal price and real price.
Exactly. The nominal price is the easy one. That's just the monetary value, the number of dollars or pounds or shillings on the price tag.
Straightforward enough.
The real price, however, that's the bedrock. That's the fundamental measure. Smith argues that the real measure of a thing's value is the quantity of labor or other necessities of life that one can acquire or command with that good.
Which leads to his foundational, much-quoted statement. Labor is the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things.
That's the one.
Now, this statement often causes confusion, doesn't it? When Smith says labor is the original measure, is he strictly talking about the labor embodied in the product, meaning the actual hours of sweat and toil spent making it, like Marx later emphasized?
This is a point where we need that nuance, especially for a deep dive audience like yours.
Yeah.
While Smith initially seems to lean towards labor embodied, the difficulty, the ingenuity, the time spent in production, he pretty quickly pivots, especially when discussing developed economies, to labor commanded.
Okay, explain the difference between labor embodied and labor commanded.
Labor embodied is the amount of time I spent making something. Say I spent 100 hours weaving a basket. That's 100 hours of embodied labor.
Got it.
Labor commanded is the quantity of other people's labor I can acquire or command by trading my product in the market. So how many hours of a baker's labor or a farmer's labor can I get in exchange for my basket?
Ah, and that shift is critical. Why?
Because it connects value back to the market and social demand. Think about it. If I spend 100 hours digging a hole in my backyard and then filling it back up again.
Okay. Pointless exercise.
Right. I have certainly embodied 100 hours of my own labor, but I can command precisely 0 hours of anyone else's labor in exchange for my filled-in hole because nobody wants it. It has no exchange value.
So the real value isn't just tied to my personal exertion, but to whether society actually demands the result of that exertion. It links back perfectly to that concept of mutual exchange needing mutual benefit.
Exactly right. The real wealth of the nation, and indeed your own real income, isn't measured by the pile of coins or banknotes you have that's just the nominal value. It's measured by the quantity of actual goods, services, and necessities you can purchase with your labor or the products of your labor. That's the real price.
And this whole distinction is basically the precursor to modern economic concepts like purchasing power parity or adjusting income for inflation to find the real income.
Absolutely. It's foundational for thinking about what economic value truly represents beyond just the numbers on a currency.
Okay, so we've established how production gets supercharged through specialized labor, division of labor, and how we create a medium of exchange based on money and trust. Now we need to understand the mechanism that actually sets the price we pay in the market.
Right, the price tag itself.
And Smith shows that the price of any commodity, when you really look closely, is rarely just one simple number reflecting one single thing. It's actually a composite.
Yes, he meticulously breaks down the price of pretty much any finished commodity into three distinct fundamental components or shares. And understanding this composition is essential because it reveals the basic principle by which society divides up the wealth it generates.
Okay, so what are those three core components of price?
First, there's the wage. This is the compensation paid to the human labor directly involved in producing the item, the worker's pay.
Makes sense.
Second, there's the profit. This is the compensation paid to the owner of the capital, or stock, as Smith often calls it. It covers their initial investment, the risk they took, and provides a return on the tools, machinery, or materials they provided.
The return for putting up the money and taking the gamble.
Exactly. And third, there's the rent. This is the compensation paid to the landlord for the use of the natural resource involved primarily, the land itself, whether for farming, mining, or just the ground the factory sits on.
So if I buy, say, a loaf of bread, I'm not just paying for the flour and water.
Not at all. You're paying the baker's wage, the mill owner's profit on his grinding machinery, the farmer's profit on his tools and seed, and the landowner's rent for the field where the wheat was grown, all bundled into that final price.
It's a bundle of claims on the final value. Wage, profit, rent.
That tripartite structure is absolutely fundamental to Smith. It's how he frames the entire discussion of how income gets distributed throughout society. It's the mechanism for determining who gets what slice of the final economic pie.
But as anyone who shops knows, the actual price we pay for that loaf of bread on a Tuesday morning isn't always the same as it was last week or will be next month. Prices fluctuate constantly.
Right, they bounce around.
So how does Smith reconcile this sort of chaotic short-term price movement with the need for some kind of underlying stability? Producers need some idea of what price they can expect long-term to plan production, right?
Yes, and this is where he introduces the absolutely crucial distinction between the market price and the natural price.
Okay, market price first. That sounds like what we actually pay.
Exactly. The market price is the actual, real-time, short-term transaction price you see in the marketplace. It's highly volatile. It's governed by immediate day-to-day shifts in supply and demand.
Like a sudden glut of apples makes the price drop, or a drought causes a shortage of wheat and the price spikes.
Precisely. That's the market price, constantly fluctuating.
The natural price, then? That must be the theoretical anchor point, the underlying baseline.
Yes, exactly. Think of it as the long-term equilibrium price. The natural price is specifically defined by Smith as the price that is just sufficient to pay the wage of labor, the profit of stock, capital, and the rent of land, all at their normal or average rates prevailing in that particular society or industry.
So if a product sells exactly at its natural price,
Then everyone involved in its production, the worker, the capitalist, the landlord, is earning just enough to cover their costs and receive the generally expected return for their contribution. It's the price needed to keep them all engaged in that line of production in the long run.
okay, now here comes, I think, the critical turning point in Smith's whole argument. This is where that mechanism of self-interest really starts to generate order out of potential chaos. How does the volatile, fluctuating market price relate to that stable underlying natural price?
The genius of Smith's insight lies in demonstrating their convergence. He argues that the relentless pursuit of individual self-interest, operating through millions of independent decisions by buyers and sellers, causes the market price to constantly gravitate toward the natural price.
Like gravity pulling it back to center. How?
Well, think about it. If the market price for bread suddenly shoots way up, far above the natural price,
Bakers are making unusually high profits.
exactly, word gets around. That excessive profit acts like a magnet, attracting new bakers or existing bakers to produce more. New capital flows into bread making.
So supply increases.
Supply floods the market, and that increased supply naturally pushes the market price back down, closer to the natural price.
Okay, and conversely, what if the market price drops too low, below the natural price?
Now bakers are losing money, or making less than they could elsewhere. They're not covering their average costs and expected profits.
So they stop baking or switch to making something else.
Right. Capital and labor start to exit the bread industry. Supply shrinks. And that growing scarcity, relative to demand, naturally pushes the market price back up towards the natural price.
Wow. So it's this constant push and pull, driven entirely by individual actors chasing their own advantage profit for the seller, value for the buyer, that keeps the market price hovering around this natural equilibrium point.
That gravitational pull driven entirely by the decentralized, self-interested actions of countless individuals, is what Smith occasionally and famously refers to as being led by an invisible hand.
Ah, the invisible hand. We had to get there eventually.
We did, but we must be clear. Smith actually uses the specific term invisible hand very sparingly in The Wealth of Nations. Only once in relation to this market mechanism, I believe.
Really, it feels like it's become shorthand for his entire philosophy.
It has, perhaps unfortunately so, because it can sound mystical. But the mechanism the metaphor describes is this very concrete process. The market self-regulating, converging towards its natural equilibrium through the disposed actions of self-interested individuals.
So the invisible hand isn't some magical force looking out for us. It's just the emergent outcome, the operational system, where millions of decentralized, self-interested actions unintentionally create a spontaneous, unplanned, self-generating economic order.
Precisely. It doesn't need a central planner shouting orders, because the constant movement of capital chasing profit and consumers chasing value automatically corrects the system, pushing prices towards that natural level where resources are allocated efficiently, at least in theory.
Okay, so once we understand that the final price of everything is composed of these three shares, wages, profit, and rent, Smith then dedicates a huge chunk of the rest of Book I to analyzing how the market actually determines the size of each of those shares.
Right, how the pie gets sliced.
In this section, I think it contains some of Smith's deepest and, frankly, sometimes darkest insights, especially regarding structural power dynamics in the economy.
Absolutely. If the division of labor sets the form of production, this analysis of distribution really defines the resulting economic stratification of society. He starts with wages, the price of labor.
And he calls wages the thermometer of prosperity. Why that specific metaphor?
Because he argues the level of wages acts as a key indicator of the overall health and dynamism of the economy. But first, he establishes a floor.
A minimum wage.
Effectively, yes, but not a legally mandated one, a natural one. He argues the minimum wage cannot, in the long run, fall below the basic subsistence level.
Why not?
Simple biology, really. If wages do not provide sufficient funds for the worker to maintain their health, their strength, and critically, to support a family and raise children to replace them in the labor force.
Then the supply of labor itself will eventually shrink. Workers will literally die off or fail to reproduce or move away.
Exactly. The market simply cannot function sustainably below this biological and social minimum required to keep the workforce going.
But it's important to note Smith has a somewhat nuanced view of subsistence, right? It's not just about bare calories needed to stay alive.
No, definitely not. For Smith, the effective subsistence wage is relative. It depends on the customs, the climate, the generally accepted standards of decency in that specific time and place.
So what was considered a necessary decency in, say, 18th century London might be vastly different and higher than what's needed in a remote, struggling colony.
Precisely. It might include things like being able to afford linen shirts or leather shoes, because not having them would be considered shameful or indecent in that particular society, even if technically you could survive without them. It's socially defined subsistence.
Okay. So above that shifting floor, wages act as this thermometer. If the economy is growing, if the stock, the capital available, is increasing faster than the population,
Then the demand for labor rises sharply. Employers are competing for workers, and wages climb well above that subsistence level, signaling economic vigor, like a rising temperature on the thermometer.
conversely, if the economy stagnates or shrinks, demand for labor falls and wages tend to sink back towards that minimum subsistence level, signaling ill health.
But here, and this is the really critical structural insight, the part often overlooked by those who only read simplified free market summaries of Smith, he discusses the inherent asymmetry in bargaining power between labor and capital.
The employers versus the employees.
Yes, Smith points out very bluntly that employers, the masters, or capitalists, as he calls them, can usually coordinate their actions and sustain a long-term conflict, like a wage dispute or a lockout, far more easily than individual laborers can sustain a strike.
Why is that?
Because the masters typically have capital reserves. They own the means of production. They can afford to weather a period of no production or reduced production, much longer than a worker, who usually depends on their weekly wage just to survive, can endure a period of no income.
They can wait the workers out.
That's the structural imbalance. It gives the masters significant leverage to potentially suppress wages, keeping them closer to that subsistence minimum, even when worker productivity might justify much higher pay.
And he even notes that the law often reinforces this imbalance.
He does. He observes that while laws might openly prohibit laborers from forming combinations, early unions, to demand higher wages, there are rarely effective laws preventing the tacit but constant and uniform combination of the masters to keep wages from rising or even to lower them.
Wow, that's a pretty clear-eyed, almost critical recognition from the supposed father of free markets that the system doesn't automatically operate on a level playing field.
It absolutely is. Smith was no naive cheerleader for capitalists. He saw the power dynamics very clearly.
Yet, despite this structural pressure downwards on wages, he does see some forces that can push them up.
Oh, yes. He's not entirely pessimistic. He observes that in situations of rapid economic growth, think of newly developing colonies needing workers or rapidly expanding cities with booming industries, the intense demand for labor, especially skilled labor, can become so strong.
That it overcomes the master's ability to combine and keep wages down.
Exactly. Combined with the potential mobility of workers, they can move to where wages are higher. This fierce competition for labor can allow wages to climb significantly above the minimum, creating real opportunities for improved living standards and even some social mobility based on skill and demand.
Okay, so that's wages.
Good.
Let's move to the second component of price, profit, the compensation for the owners of capital or stock. How does Smith justify profit's existence?
Profit, for Smith, is justified primarily as the necessary reward for several things. First, for advancing the initial capital needed to start production, paying wages, buying materials before any product is sold. Second, for taking the calculated risks involved in the business venture it might fail.
Okay, investment and risk.
And third, crucially, for the act of saving, or abstinence that is, for the capitalist choosing not to consume their wealth immediately, but instead saving and investing it to build up the stock of tools, machinery, and materials that increases the economy's future productive capacity. Profit is the incentive for that accumulation.
Right. So how does the market regulate the rate of profit? Does it also tend towards some natural level?
Yes, very much so. And it's driven by similar competitive pressures as wages. As capital accumulates in a society and markets mature, competition between capitalists intensifies dramatically.
Because there's more money chasing investment opportunities.
Exactly. And capital, especially money capital, is highly mobile. It flows very quickly towards wherever the returns, the profits, seem highest.
So if profits are exceptionally high in, say, the wool industry,
New investors pour money into wool production, existing producers expand, supply increases, competition heats up, prices might fall, and that inevitably drives the profit rate in the wool industry down, closer to the general average rate of profit prevailing across the whole economy.
so this mobility of capital acts as a kind of leveling mechanism, constantly pushing profits in all industries towards some kind of modest average rate of return.
That's the tendency, yes. The market competition constantly squeezes excess profits. However, Smith is also realistic here. He recognizes that not all profits are average.
Some people consistently make more. How?
Well, those capitalists who can achieve significant economies of scale, or maybe gain privileged access to superior information about markets or technology, or those who manage to secure favorable institutional rules, maybe even outright monopoly privileges from the government.
They can shield themselves from that full competitive pressure.
Precisely. They can capture excess or thick profits, as sometimes termed, returns that are substantially and persistently above that competitive average. So while the general tendency of the market is towards a modest average return, strategic advantages, information asymmetries, and institutional factors allow some players to consistently pull ahead and accumulate wealth much faster.
Okay, that makes sense. Finally, then, we come to the third slice of the price pie, rent, the compensation for land ownership. This one often feels the most contentious, and Smith views it, you said, as almost a political economy of surplus capture.
Yes, rent is distinct. Smith argues it arises from two fundamental things. First, the existence of private, legally enforced exclusive ownership of land. And second, the natural, inherent productive powers of that land.
Powers like what?
Its fertility, for example. A highly fertile field naturally yields more crops for the same amount of labor and capital input compared to a patch of barren, marginal land. Or its location. A piece of land right in the bustling city center, perfect for a shop, naturally generates more potential revenue than an identical plot located miles out in the countryside.
So rent captures the economic advantage provided by nature itself or by strategic location.
Exactly. And Smith's perspective on rent, compared to wages and profit, is quite subtle but really important. He tends to view rent less as a cause or determinant of the price and more as a consequence or result of the overall pricing mechanism.
What do you mean by that? How is it a consequence rather than a cause?
Well, his reasoning is that the price of the commodity produced, say, wheat, must first be high enough to cover the necessary costs of production. That means paying the workers their necessary wages to keep them working, and paying the farmer the average rate of profit on their invested capital to keep them farming.
Okay, wages and profit have to be covered first, or production stops.
Right. Whatever revenue is left over after those necessary costs, wages and profit at their natural rates, have been covered, that residual surplus revenue. That is what gets captured by the landlord as rent. It's captured purely by virtue of their property rights over that naturally advantageous or well-located resource.
So the landlord doesn't necessarily contribute labor or take capital risk in the same way, but they capture the surplus generated by the land's inherent qualities.
That's largely Smith's view. He famously states that the landlord often demands a rent even for the natural produce of the earth, essentially capturing the benefit of nature's bounty or society's development, creating valuable locations without necessarily having to labor or invest new capital themselves to generate it.
So rent becomes this powerful mechanism for wealth accrual that can be somewhat detached from direct productive effort, stemming instead from ownership and the inherent scarcity or quality of the land itself.
Yes, it occupies a unique position in Smith's framework of distribution. #tag outro. So when you step back and look at Book One of The Wealth of Nations as a whole, it really is the foundational design blueprint for so much that followed.
Absolutely. Smith meticulously showed us how this complex social order, this harmony, even this monumental creation of wealth, doesn't have to be imposed by some central authority.
No, it originates spontaneously. It bubbles up from these simple, almost innate human habits of exchange, specialization, and crucially, the institutionalization of trust through things like money.
We've traced that incredible journey today from the seemingly simple idea of the egoistic individual just looking out for number one.
All the way to the explosive productivity of the pin factory, driven by the division of labor.
We saw why money isn't just metal, but fundamentally relies on a social contract, on trust.
And how the seemingly chaotic dance of market prices actually has this underlying tendency, this self-regulating convergence towards a natural equilibrium.
All driven, as you said, by the emergent effects of countless individual actions, the thing often nicknamed the invisible hand.
The genius really is in the synthesis, showing how egoism, when channeled through the mechanisms of specialization and exchange, doesn't lead to chaos, but actually creates a coherent, self-improving, wealth-generating society.
But, and it's a big but, the text also leaves us with some really potent warnings, doesn't it? Smith was incredibly clear-eyed about those structural power imbalances baked into the system of distribution.
He really was, that inherent asymmetry between labor and capital, the ability of masters to combine and potentially suppress wages.
And the mechanism of rent, allowing significant wealth accumulation based purely on ownership, potentially disconnected from productive effort. He saw all that.
Which brings us right back to that challenge we kind of set up at the beginning. If the market mechanism, the invisible hand, spontaneously creates wealth and a certain kind of order, we are immediately left with the imperative for what the original outline called visible responsibility.
Right. So here's the final thought we want to leave you, the listener, with to mull over. Given those inherent power imbalances that Smith himself noted in the distribution of income, in the relationships between wages, profit, and rent, what necessary visible responsibility?
Meaning what deliberate rules, what laws, what kind of civic ethics, what institutional designs?
It's absolutely required from us, from society and its institutions, to ensure that the wealth and the order generated by that powerful invisible hand engine actually serves the entire community, to ensure it doesn't just overwhelmingly benefit those who happen to own the capital and the land.
It's that constant, ongoing, necessary negotiation, isn't it? The work required to turn a functionally efficient economic system into a truly just and equitable one.
A deep dive indeed. Well, thank you for joining us as we explored the absolute foundational structure of modern economic thought in Book One of The Wealth of Nations.
Always fascinating to go back to the source.
We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.